During the winter of 1996, having filed for a Chapter 11 bankruptcy claim, Marvel Comics was backed into a corner like never before. The entire comic book industry was hit by a staggering financial collapse as comic book retailers went bust after an overall sales drop of 70%. The shenanigans that followed would save Marvel from bankruptcy, but it would only come through a merger acquisition by then Marvel owner Ron Perelman with Isaac Perlmutter's Toy Biz. Having dug out of one hole and their financial position left in jeopardy, there were still other problems Marvel needed to fix. One was their over-reliance on the sales of The Amazing Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and X-Men, three of their biggest hitters, keeping them afloat in a sea of trouble. But in the 90s, Marvel Comics started to feel a shift within their reader base, one which hadn't been growing very much over the years. There were echoes within the company of 50 years of continuity and baggage being a major factor in attracting a new and fresh generation of young readers. Then, in early 2000, came Bill Jemas at the helm of Marvel Comics and his newly appointed editor-in-chief, Joe Quesada. Quesada had been previously working in Image Comics, and one of his first projects at Marvel was to oversee a retcon of Marvel's original continuity, with major characters finally getting a clean slate to start again. This line of stories would be set in a new universe, the Ultimate Universe, and for its first entry, Quesada brought in a writer he'd worked with at Image Comics, Brian Michael Bendis. Around September of that year, the first Ultimate Spider-Man comic was released with a writer-artist duo of Bendis and Mark Bagley helming what would go on to be Marvel's longest-running writer-artist team in history, with 110 issues under their belt. And this consistency would be one of the key factors to Ultimate Spider-Man's critical and fan acclaim over its run. Peter Parker was back as a teenager, Aunt May and Uncle Ben were hipsters to the T, and every supporting character was given a new but familiar take in the mold of Peter. Bendis was pivotal to the early origin run more so than what he did later on in the series, because he set a tone that would be consistent throughout the entire series. Before Spider-Man came along, Bendis had his roots set firmly in crime noir stories, and his focus had always been on the seedier aspects of dramatic storytelling. This allowed him to focus on characters with a grey lens that wasn't seen in the early camp of the Amazing Fantasy issue 15. Bendis and Bagley used what Lee and Ditko had done to propel Spider-Man's origin further forward and offer a more generational tale to the kids of the early 2000s. So while Bendis focused on realistic dialogue and decompressed storytelling, spreading out an 11-page origin story into 180 pages and approaching it with a slower, more methodical pace, this saga approach would become a mainstay throughout the run. Artist Mark Bagley did his part to marry Bendis' brilliant material with expressive and detailed artwork. Ultimate Spider-Man is a gorgeously visualized story to feast your eyes upon, and Bagley's artwork consists of cartoonish proportions which still manage to evoke a sense of realism owing to his distinctly drawn facial expressions and an ability to portray dramatic body languages at key moments within the story. And all of this is manifested in a more dynamic shift towards character progression. In issue 13, aptly titled Confessions, Peter decides to tell his best friend Mary Jane that he is Spider-Man, and it plays out something like this. Each panel highlights the nuance Bagley brings to pivotal scenes like these. His mastery over expressions and emotive gestures enhances Bendis' sometimes wordy narrative. It's a perfect union of the bard and his muse. Issue 13 also happens to be my favorite issue within the story. The biggest changes to Lee and Ditko's original works wasn't in the reimagining of old characters as new people, but rather reflecting the world of the 90s and the early 2000s and the narratives that had sprung up in the intervening period. Only 3 years before Marvel filed their bankruptcy claim, Neil Gaiman stood before comic retailers and warned them of an inevitable collapse in the comic book industry. You had an entire country obsessed with getting rich and convinced that it was impossible that tulips could ever be less than the ultimate perfect investment object. Comics are for reading and enjoying, like tulips are for planting and blossoming and appreciating. His commentary was on the new collector mindset that had taken over comic book owners who thought of comics as investment opportunities rather than stories. This new world, fraught with murky waters and long shadows, has its echoes within the Ultimate Spider-Man. In his final battle with Kingpin in the Enforcers saga, Spider-Man has to find evidence of the Kingpin murdering someone and avail the help of Ben Urich, a Daily Bugle journalist, to apprehend the crime lord. Beating him wasn't as simple as throwing in a few knockout punches using his spider strength. Instead, Peter had to abide by the system to pursue justice. Our early notions of simple superhero justice had changed with the advent of a new century and a new redefined world. Maybe we no longer believed that one man dressed in tights could solve all our problems, never mind a spastic teenager at that. Peter's journey is laid out to be as relentless as ours. His Parker luck is our Parker luck. Every moment of rest is followed by a moment of disastrous peril. He is 16 and already world-weary, tired of fighting the criminal element of New York protected by the bureaucracy of shady agencies making his every effort feel futile. He's exposed to disturbing events that traumatize him, just like we're traumatized in our lives. He lives a jaded life, but at least one filled with levity, romance, and the warmth of individual characters. It's fitting then that from a morally and ethically grey world of business failure sprung the brilliance of Ultimate Spider-Man. It was the spark of how the innocence of comic books, an industry built on the readership of kids, had evolved into something complicated and more insidious, but was still capable of producing great stories. Ultimate Spider-Man wasn't just a rebranding of Spider-Man, but also of Marvel Comics and its new reader base. It was a reflection of what we wanted from our superhero stories, unshackled from years of plot contrivances and continuity, of a more deeply drawn narrative that reflected our own struggles.